I don't see our professionals being thrown to the dogs. In fact, this whole thing about malpractice, reporting them and dragging them over the coals, I actually am dead against it. You don't do that to doctors. Why are you doing it to professional geologists?
Today I'm catching up with Andy Clay. And I've never met Andy before, but he reached out because of a mutual acquaintance that we had. And he started talking about everything that I'm passionate about, whether it's variance, resource classification, JOR codes, SAMREC codes. And he's got some really interesting angles coming from an oil and gas background. So Andy's a geologist, but also got a mining engineering degree, and he works in the valuation space. He's Johannesburg based. And he started Venmin Deloitte many years ago, so he definitely knows what he's talking about. But as you'll see, I'm very excited to put this one out to you guys because we don't necessarily agree on everything here, and conversation gets interesting and gets heated, and we're definitely passionately covering a few of these stories. So we're going into the nitty-gritty of uncertainty. Andy is a proponent of putting ranges on resource estimates. Ooh, where do we land? I'm sure he got opinions on it, but Andy has a few, so we explore that. Don't feel we've necessarily come out of it, but certainly something to think about, and hopefully it will be of interest to people listening. So let's get into it. How are you doing, Andy?
No, very good, and Errol Smart sends his best.
That's exactly what I was going to raise, because I did look a little bit into the history, because obviously our orbits haven't quite, touched each other over the years. But I did think Venmin, I had some interactions years ago, and it was through Errol Smart, because I was at the Vubachikwu mine, and I think you guys were doing a resource there, and that's a long time ago now. That's 16 years ago. So, yeah. But do you catch up with Errol regularly, or?
No, I've been pushing the Variance towers a lot now. Even though it was published in 2012, it hasn't really taken off.
Okay.
And so I have been pushing it, and I've got a number of papers out because the projects I'm working on are all of these specialist metals now.
Right.
And the big question comes, how many holes must I drill? And with Errol, I got hold of your number through Errol on the one group that I'm with Craig Hutton.
Yeah.
And Craig's a very good guy. We're very close friends, actually.
Right. Yeah, it is a small world, but that certainly, because I was actually going to ask you, how did we actually get in touch? Because you sent me an email, and maybe, for people listening, if this comes to air at some point, you talked about Curisco codes and resource estimation, a lot of stuff that immediately I can see, I have an interest in, and I talk about this topic on the channel a lot. But variance towers and so on, I got to listen to that later, so maybe we'll park that for what we're coming back to in this conversation. But you're in South Africa right now.
I currently advise to a number of companies, one of which is EY.
Yeah,
and for the last 30 years, I've basically been working with audit firms.
Yeah.
And that's largely because in 2000, the International Accounting Standards Board published a extractive industries consultation paper. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth going to get it. It's on the International Accounting Standards Board's website.
Okay.
It was published in 2000. And they were asking the key question, which is, why is it that mineral resources in the oil and gas industry are treated differently to the way mineral resources are treated in the mining industry?
Yeah.
And as part of that expose, there are probably, I would say, about 30 to 40 chapters which provide the thoughts behind, for instance, a good one to go for is impairment. How do you impair a mining asset?
Yeah.
What are the triggers? What are the policies? Because remember, the accounting standards are principles-based, not rules-based.
Yeah.
And so I've always tried to align my inputs into code writing along those lines in a parallel space to the accountants.
Yeah.
So when you see a stupid statement or a stupid rule, then you sort of think, well, how would the accountants have handled that? Because don't think that they don't have stupid rules as well.
Yeah.
But it's a nice parallel universe with a much bigger audience
Yeah,
And
sure.
then I also work in oil and gas, and that is 50 times bigger than the
Well,
minerals industry.
Let's start there. But before we do, maybe because what would like to do, not just for my own sake, because we never really chatted before. We had a couple of email exchanges, and I looked into your background a bit because I've sort of been vaguely familiar with your name, but and your background. But could you just capture in 2 minutes your career and what your background is? Because I think you have both geology and engineering degrees, and you've obviously seen a few things. Could you just capture that so that we know the background?
Yeah, so I basically did my undergraduate work in Cardiff University. I was partly a school of mines and then switched to geology, pure geology. Went to Rhodesia, as it was then, to work for the Geological Survey and did
Nice.
field mapping for 2 years.
Yeah.
Then I came through to EGRU, the Economic Geology Research Unit, with Professor Des Pretorius,
Yeah.
and I did my MSc there on lead zinc mineralization in the vets. Then I joined Rio Tinto doing a short spell of field exploration. Then I went and worked for an industrial minerals company and learned how to do sales, which was interesting.
Yeah.
Because the thing with industrial minerals is who you sell it to and what they use it for is the critical thing. Then I joined Rand Mines, went to the Free State, worked at Harmony Gold Mine, and we basically introduced the first digital computerized ore reserves within a period of 3 years. It was a pretty monumental exercise. And then I went to head office, realized that the mining industry was needing to go through a very significant change because they had the 7 big mining houses at that stage. This is before they all broke up. And then my ex-business partner, boss, Willow Steer at the time, he knew the 3 wise men at Rand Merchant Bank, which was an emerging merchant bank in South Africa. And then we moved across and set up Venman then, Ventures in Mining. And from then on, I've always been involved in looking at the big thing for me is valuation,
Right.
is working out how you translate the technical content, quantities and qualities into rands and cents, dollars and cents. And so that's where I've been. And then over the time, I was one of the founding members of the SAMREC committee. I've always been a member of OZM. I've been a member of Canadian institutes. I'm now a member of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists and SPE. And I'm on the listings advisory panels. My whole core being is around writing rules or changing them if they're bulled. So when I saw your paper, the one where you sort of talked about the, what would you call it? The perfunctory statements that are made about compliance.
Oh, the table one paper.
Yes.
Yes.
And I did a table 1 comparison of all of the different codes about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And pointed out to the stock exchange that we have 250 individual line items in South Africa. I think JORC has got 150, NI 5101, which is the preferred reporting for me.
Okay.
Because it's just itemized.
Yes,
Has only got about 100. And then the thing is, there's a lot of the statements or a lot of the requirements to report, which actually, for the intelligent layman, are completely irrelevant.
Yes. Yeah, they are. I mean, who wants to
So
see
that's
5
my
pages
potted
of
history.
variograms?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So now, look, I think I could easily talk for hours about this, but that would get me in trouble with the producer here, who's got to go home to his family soon. But and I don't really quite know where to start on that. But if we just go with rules, right? Because you said I like changing rules, and I've read your email a couple of times to see particularly the angle that I think you're coming from, because I think, generally speaking, when we're on this channel, sometimes students be a bit of an echo chamber, right? Because, you agree on these things, so there isn't anything to actually discuss and improve on because we're all saying the same thing, and that makes it a little bit tricky. And it's also very easy to throw stones at stuff, that isn't working, and it's a typical consultant move to say it's all broken and we should fix things and it's not working or whatever. So I'm always cautious with that angle. But if I go back to that paper and maybe to see what your additional thoughts on that concept are. I mean, I wasn't part of the JORC 2012 change. I am part of the current change, and I know what people are working on. And by the time this airs, maybe the new JORC code 2020X, as we're calling it at the moment, in a bit of a poke at the fact that we've been at this for a few years. We know it's going to change because it wasn't quite working. It was intended to work well, but people never really knew what to put in there. And that's what I try to demonstrate. There's this bucket of stuff where general practitioners just throw things around. Nobody ever reads it anyway. And it's just a rule ultimately to be broken and not adding the value that it was intended to provide. I too am a fan of the NR 43-101 structure, although I also am very much, and so we have kind of butchered the various formats out there internally so that when we write a JORC report, and I'll just do this for the sake of the discussion, where we actually follow a structure as well and we borrow from NR 43-101, we're not going to religiously name all the chapters exactly the same. If we don't need them, we don't need them. So I like the structure, but I do like about JORC particularly that there is some focus or onus on the competent person doing what they consider to be the right thing, and to have some flexibility in how they report things. And so I can see pros and cons.
But that doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
That doesn't work.
No, but this gets you into the whole fairly awkward space of, and we're having this discussion right now. I went to Sydney the other day for a talk on JORC, and it's actually fascinating. You can do a talk about the most fascinating mineral system that you've worked on, and you might draw 20, 30 people into a room, and they're die-hard geologists with woolen socks and beards. But, you put JORC up as a topic and you get 80 people in the room and they're all sitting front row. So it's definitely a topic that people care about. And I always joke, these new rules will fundamentally change how we break them, right? That's ultimately the problem with this sort of stuff. But then, so what is the solution? I mean, so no table one or no form of table one, or should we, with all codes, move to the NR 43-101 quote unquote structure? What do you think is best?
I think there's a couple of points I'd raise as what you said. You said we're saying the same things, but we're not. That's the fundamental problem. And what we've had in South Africa is we created a readers panel. And I can explain exactly how the readers panel came about, because I used to advise to the stock exchange as SAMREC was being introduced, as a friend of the family type thing. Mm-hmm. And there was a company listed in South Africa for about a week called Noble Minerals. And that prospectus I used to use as a teaching aid to tell people just how bad things can be. Mm-hmm. And they did have a reader, but he didn't actually know what he was doing. So I complained. That company was delisted immediately because it was all fraudulent. So in essence, when we looked at that problem, the readers panel, we said, okay, let's set up a panel where people can read. And I took the concept to the South African codes. They call it the SSC. It's the governing body for the different codes. And they said, that's a great idea to create a readers panel, because they actually asked me to be the main reader. And I said, I'm not doing it on my own. That's ridiculous, because half the time I'll be reading my own work. Can't do that. So they said, right, let's set up a readers panel. We'll choose industry experts in each commodity. So iron, gold, platinum. You can imagine how many thousands of experts you're going to need to get now. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the point. You didn't need a technical reader. You needed someone that would read the document, the technical document, and see how it fitted with the requirements of the stock exchange. Mm-hmm. So the two would gel. Now, you see, we've had the fortunate advantage in South Africa that the JSE has always been involved in the writing of the codes. And I know I've had my own personal jousts with ASIC, etc. And, the thing is, they are not technically qualified. The stock exchange is not technically qualified to opine on the integrity or the accuracy of these types of reports. So who do you get to do it? So what happened was put the readers panel, and then every report that we would write, there'd be a joust. Because the reader who would be reading my report would just decry what I'd written. Why? Just because. We got rid of that. They wrote a statement in the rules saying that you cannot be a reader unless you can demonstrate that you have no other interest that would otherwise affect your independence.
Yep.
Now, independence is another thing.
Yeah.
Because it was ruled against asking independent reports to be prepared. Unlike in oil and gas, generally, when you do a listing, it's got to be an independent qualified reserves evaluators report. We turned that down because the industry rejected it on the basis that they said there weren't enough people to do the work.
Yep.
Rubbish.
Yep.
Rubbish.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to stop you for a second, because there's a lot in there, and I'm not taking notes, but I'm trying to make some mental notes, because, you started by saying we're not saying the same thing. But on this topic, I think personally I'm very well aligned on this, because I know about the readers panel. I talked about it before, and I know what people have tried to do over the years to a reasonable degree to understand why it wouldn't work. I mean, there's the independence, there's the conflicts of interest, and good luck finding all those experts, right? And then still the experts, a lot of them still wake up with a serious bout of Dunning-Kruger on any average morning, right? So it's not that easy to put that panel together. However, I am not a big fan, and most people know this, of the self-regulation. I could provide stronger words. I think it's idiotic to go through society all your life, school, university, police, everything else, and then you write something and you determine whether you yourself are competent enough to write this report. I think that's, to put it quite frankly, bullshit, and we can see that in all the data in front of us. So a reading panel, or whatever you want to call it, the principle of that, I think should get daylight, but not in the form it was originally proposed, either there or on this side, because I think we or they, or whoever they and we is these days, because it's all global, right, are discussing and have tried very similar things, whether it's informal or formal, because there has been an informal reading panel here for years, and I'm in Dunedin, but this was mostly Australia-based. And as you might know, I started a website where all these public reports were reviewed, 5-star wise, like your TripAdvisor, which worked very, very well until somebody got seriously pissed off with me and I had to make a choice. So, but the point is, it worked and then some. And I do personally believe that there is a solution there in an objective median of opinions about highly technical matters that by themselves cannot be trusted to the self-regulation or the self-opinion of a competent or qualified person.
Yeah, but again, unpacking that is relatively easy, because if you go back to what I said to you originally, I've worked for the last 30 years in the accounting arena. And that's when because previously, up until about 20 years ago, you couldn't put mineral resources and reserves on the balance sheet. You can now. And that's the efforts that we've made to actually quantify. And there's a whole lot of wording in the accounting standards, like reliable measure is a very good term. The accountants struggle with this all the time.
Of course.
What do you think they do with the booking of intellectual property for a unicorn? What do you think they do? That's big smoke and mirrors. There's no value that you can. Some goofball comes up, says it's worth $1 trillion.
Well,
Now
I mean,
what?
goodwill is a wonderful word, right? I mean, it's what value do you assign to my company or your company? I mean, 90% of it is goodwill. So, I've always.
Yeah, but historically, mineral reserves and resources were booked into goodwill.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And you see, it shouldn't.
No.
The MPV of the business, that's the big mantra is, what's the difference between value and price?
Sure.
Price is set in the market.
Yeah.
Value is determined by calculations.
Yeah.
And you guys in Australia have got this, you keep this stupid term, fair market value.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's either fair value or market value. It's not
Yeah.
fair market value.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay.
then you've got, is it land rich or is it property rich? Well, I know bullshit.
Yeah. Well, let's because the valuation space, I'd like to maybe separate that out, because I'm not an asset valuer, and I've always stayed clear of that. Not for lack of interest, but you can't focus on everything. So it's not a space that I'm super familiar with. Although I've had some people on the podcast that are very skilled in it, and obviously
it's a place you must go. It's a place you must go.
Yeah,
I never thought that you would be scared of any topic.
I'm not.
You don't know. Go and find it.
The thing is, it's not that I'm scared of it, but I want to ask, like this topic at the readers panel, I'm fascinated about it. I've done my homework on it, and I think I can ask pesky questions that really lay bare the actual issues, right? Without trying to be cautiously tiptoeing around political bullshit subjects that would get you into trouble. With Velmin, I'm just not aware of it enough. I do have stupid questions though, and I'm interested to ask you some of those, because from a valuation perspective, I see a lot of resources sitting on balance sheets that really shouldn't be there. And indeed, the impairment story, I do have questions there, and it will probably not be the right questions. But before we do that, I do want to come back to this reading panel philosophy, and because we've thrown a whole bunch of things around now, and perhaps if people are listening to this, they might need to find the angle here a little bit. So for me, what you just said, the history there and the reading panel and table 1 and the various codes and how prescriptive they are. Can you just put down what the solution structure should look like? Because ASX, for instance, has had an input into the new JOR code, as they did have previously, because they are on the JOR committee. They have somebody sitting there and they know what they're doing, and there are geologists working for ASX, and we can argue about how experienced they are, and to some, because there's always people grumping about that. But I don't think that's necessarily the problem. What does the perfect world look like to you then? I mean, is it an oil and gas copy of what they do, or what does it look like? Should the JORC change? Should SAMREC change? Should we all change? What does the playing field look like if you had a blank canvas right now?
Let's go back to auditing. In the audit world, there is a thing called the PCAOB. So it's the Public Commissioners Audit Oversight Board. Now, it's a 600-pound gorilla. If you make a mistake, it comes over the hill and stomps all over you. Mm-hmm. So the auditors are extremely cautious about keeping working papers and making sure that there is an audit trail on everything that they do to justify the work that they've done. Because if they can't, and then there's a problem and there's a PCAOB investigation, go look it up. And you get slapped with big fights. I mean, I'm talking really big fights, hundreds of millions of dollars. So the audit companies are extremely concerned about making sure they do things correctly. Once we realized that we could potentially bring on, I think it's IAS 16, not quite, I can't remember the code, the accounting standard, but to bring the reserves and resources onto the balance sheet, or the value of the business onto the balance sheet, has to have a very structured approach to being able to get that done. And the rule for an accountant is that if you are auditing an area that you are not technically qualified to opine on, call in an expert, which is why I sold my business to Deloitte, create that capacity.
But when you say not technically capable, so that has to be through accreditation. Yeah, but assessed by whom? Is it if you're accredited, you are therefore capable, or registered and accredited, or is it self-judged? Yes. Right.
No, it's the standard professional qualification of, a minimum of 5 years experience in the type and style of mineralization, etc.
But you're
properly registered.
This is actually the pinch point right here, right now, because I can be registered with the OZOMEM, which is just, John, my mate, just signs me up because he's a buddy, and suddenly I've got 5 years experience. Boom, I'm competent, right? Self-assessed, here we go. And I can sign off on resources and nobody would bat an eyelid. And this is the world we live in. But the point is now, should we go, and this is the live issue right now in Australia, should we go to accreditation and registration, just like plumbers, electricians, engineers, and so on? Because without that, this is an open playing field for anybody to say anything. Do you see my point?
Well, no, I do. So here we have a thing called SACNAS, which is the South African Council for Natural Science, which regulates and forces me to be registered with them.
How do you register? What's the prerequisites for being registered?
Generally, it's academic qualifications. It's a workbook of past experience signed off by whoever you were working for, almost like a logbook, basically.
But it's the same here, and it's not working. It's just not working.
Well, okay, but before you knock it, so I don't disagree that it's a problem, but look at the other industries. Go to oil and gas.
Please.
There you should be registered with the American Association of Petroleum Geologists, or the Society for Petroleum Engineers, or the Society for the Petroleum Economic Engineers. They're all different things. AAPG is biggest. You need a minimum of, I think it's 5 years experience to do a QRE report, or if you're a qualified reserves evaluator, then you need 10 years minimum practical experience, all logbooked. And they have a website that you can go to on SPE, which is probably about 50 different sections to demonstrate a checkbox as to whether or not you have done and are, in your own mind, satisfied that you can tick box all of these different areas of expertise: geophysics, seismics, mineralogy, well classification, you name it.
So it's effectively the same.
Something like that.
No, but we have something like that, and it's not working. I mean, what we have in the mineral industry, and my philosophy of this is that we have this, right? And the problem is, if you are a geologist in the oil and gas industry, because all of my friends in Holland, because I'm Dutch and I effectively studied to become an oil and gas geologist, like most of my class in the day, because we live on we live on a clump of clay, and that's all we can do, right? And I thought, I don't like all that muddy stuff. I'll find some real rock somewhere. That's not a correct version of the truth, but so I understand a little bit what goes on there, but I know people before you get taken on this journey. I always joke, you start with shell, you die with shell, right? And here you're a geologist thrown on a rig. Suddenly you're a project geologist 3 months later because you can put a Gantt chart together in Excel, manage a budget, and manage a driller. 2 years later you're a senior geologist with a nice salary because the coal mines need you because nobody wants to do it. And 5 years later I'm a competent person. And cool. Right? And then people tell you, now we need a JORC report. And 80% of the people think, oh, I'm not smart enough to do that. But 20% of people think, yeah, I can do that. Sure, I've done this for 10 years. And that's the kind of mentality that drifts into the mining space, particularly because it's full with opportunists, junior companies with 3 employees. There is not that fundamental training ground that all of my friends gone through oil and gas. You don't go sit on an oil well that costs $50 million to drill if you don't know what the hell you're doing, right? Here in RC rig, hey, have you got 2 arms and 2 legs? That's what you do. And there's a fire extinguisher and a red button if it goes wrong, and good luck, right? So that's just the imbalance that I've seen between oil and gas and here. And self-regulation might work there, but here it's just not working. Thoughts?
Well, I can tell, René, that it's obviously a deep issue for you.
Oh, absolutely. Very deep.
For me, it's not so much of an issue, because I think at the end of the day, there's a huge level of trust that has to be passed to the professional persons who are doing their work. And I think that same principle applies right across industry, all service lines, etc. I mean, sure, people have to earn their stripes. And I believe everybody should be keeping a detailed logbook.
But you, sorry,
like a pilot.
I'm fascinated, right? Because and I've read a little bit of what I found online as well. But you said the trust thing. You're an experienced business guy, right? Like really, with all the paperwork behind it. I mean, I love trust. I mean, with friends and family and in business, every relationship that we have as a consultants company is based on trust. But trust doesn't go to the ASX. Trust doesn't go to ESIC. This needs to be, we need systems in place.
You think they have loftier values than us? That's rubbish. There's just as many useless people at the stock exchange than there are in industry.
No. I'm not saying that they have lofty values. I'd be the last one to say that. But I know the people that work there, and I know they're trying to do the right thing. But they too live in a world that is constrained. And they write the rules. Yeah.
So what gives them the qualifications to write rules, many of which are stupid rules?
No, I don't disagree with that, but I don't need to go there. But the trust thing is interesting because the whole reason why we are in this discussion generally in the industry is about trust. We trusted that you could self-regulate your own competence, and you didn't, right? And how do we get out of that? Because these issues that you just mentioned with the companies where things went wrong. So we've got malpractice, obviously. We've got people doing shady things. That's different, right? And we've discussed this the last few years at length here to try and look for better ways between JOR to ASAMM, AIG, ASX, the JOR committee, obviously, and ESIC. But what does it need to look like for some of these? I keep calling them train wrecks, right? Because we've had a few companies recently that lost a lot of money, right? And when you go and analyze this, the argument is, and I'm paraphrasing here because it's complex, but it goes along the lines of this company has lost $400 million. And it's to do with that person not being competent enough in whatever technical thing they did because they overstate their own capabilities. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that before I get all the nasty comments coming online, but that's kind of the argument. Now, there are parts of that, and that's where my paper comes in, because if you look at 1 month of table ones, you go, well, I can kind of see what they're saying because, not that I understand all of this, but I can tell that this is rubbish, right? And if that's rubbish, then what else is rubbish? Whether you're an accountant, an evaluation person, and so on. You see my point?
I do, but I think you're being too harsh.
Okay.
It's not as though the mining industry should be singled out for special attention because there's been failures, because there's failures across the board.
100%.
And
Good
I mean,
argument.
working in the audit firms, every single one of them have had big failures somewhere along the line.
Mm-hmm.
And we've had more than our fair share in South Africa in particular. But don't think that they get away with it because the PCAOB is on their case. Then there's civil suits, there's criminal suits against these people. But I don't see our professionals being thrown to the dogs. In fact, this whole thing about malpractice, reporting them and dragging them over the coals, I actually am dead against it. You don't do that to doctors. Why are you doing it to professional geologists?
Well, they are doing it to doctors here. I mean, and I'm not that I'm disagreeing.
Well, is it right? Is it right?
Kind of, it depends a bit. If they amputate the wrong leg, then I'd probably be fairly grumpy about it, right? I mean,
but you know what?
Yeah.
The general status quo. It's like writing rules because one person breaks a rule. You now scoop up the whole world. That's wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. We've been too ready to go and actually stick in a new rule because somebody made a mistake.
Yeah. So I agree with that completely, right? So I'm definitely not saying that I'm not a proponent of 100 million rules. Let me try and get that right. I'm not.
Or a big stick.
I'm also not saying that we need a big stick. And I'm also, I think you made a very valid point. What's the problem that we're trying to solve is the thing that I've actually asked in the paper and in other platforms as well. I mean, and consultants suck at that. They always want to solve all these problems to make more problems to solve. And that's kind of why, particularly here in Australia, consultants are quite often associated with changes in JOR because then they can charge more money, right, for the next report. And, I find that a little bit unfair as well. It's a bit of an overcorrection. But is there truly a problem? And the opponents, and I think what you're saying is along those lines, it's a market and stuff goes wrong. And if you go on the road, people, drive into trees. And if you look at any industry, whether it's accounting, shit goes wrong, get on with it. I mean, the question is to what degree the market, and this is an open, honest question, I'm not saying, and this is the famous paper by Pharma, right? If you need a fair market, to use your term again, what does it look like? And is it a sliding scale, or is there a binary threshold? Where does it end? How much regulation do you want? And do you want to capture any and all? Where does a boundary lie?
Well, René, that was the reason to get hold of you and to talk to about the variance towers and using statistics. I mean, my entire career has been based on using statistics to define the variability or assess the uncertainty and the risk associated with the very things that you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's what the variance towers does. So we're looking to take sets of samples, relate them directly to the geology in some form or other, and then test how many samples do you need to get to a level of confidence that is quantified.
Yeah.
So it's not some goofball saying I need to drill on a regularized grid and I'm going to need 500 holes. You say no. To get to inferred, so I can start my work on an economic model, I need 30 samples.
Yeah.
To get to indicated, I need 200, and to get to measured, I need 500.
Okay.
Why do I need 500? Because I don't need that level of confidence. But I saw a very good paper by, I think I mentioned this in the notes that I sent you. Mm-hmm. I saw a very good paper by a highly experienced petroleum geologist in Norway. And he looked at the relationship between the actual versus the estimates of individual oil fields, what the estimate was relative to what they actually ultimately got.
Yeah.
It's all over the place.
Yeah.
And what he even says is that as time goes on, even with improved geological modeling and computer modeling, it doesn't improve. So what does it say? It says when you're forecasting and you're estimating, you're not predicting the future. You're embracing uncertainty and understanding the consequences and the impact. Well, that's what we should do.
So, I mean,
so just let me finish.
Yeah, please.
Let me just finish there. So essentially what the variance tower does is it not only gives you the number of samples that you need to get to a certain confidence limits, but it gives you the upper and the lower limits of, let's say, grade. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm a proponent of not quoting one grade in a resource statement.
Yeah.
You should have the min-max.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, no. Look, I picked it up from the brief comments that you sent, and also a very favorite subject of mine. So I can certainly hook into this from a few angles, because I actually discussed this a couple of times before on the channel. And let's start with a point of agreement, and then I'll probably veer into some objections to that process, and we'll see where we land on that. I think the fact that we do all this work, and with all this work, I mean anything from the bloody standards and the blanks and the duplicates to everything and the drilling grids and the whole thing together, and we have all these advanced geostatistical methods, and then we say this is the number, right? That blows my mind, and I've made this exact point before on the channel. I find it fascinating that you capture uncertainty with a range. That's literally what statistics do. So, and then you say inferred, and this is the number. I don't get that at all. So I think I'm completely aligned with that. And we've discussed previously, and there are proponents for that range to be utilized. There are pros and cons, and obviously if you state an exploration target, for instance, on the JORC, you must use a range. At that point, it is actually regulated that you must use a range to state the numbers because of that uncertainty. But people along the same breath say, well, inferred is higher confidence, so a number is fine. But to me, and I've seen the stuff that you sent through as well, I think that is a perfect candidate for a statement of range there. So I'm comfortable with that principle.
But René, the problem is when you see something like this, so they say quote ranges for exploration targets. That is so uncertain.
Yeah, they're made up numbers.
You should quote, so you should be quoting just one range. Yeah. And I've got a very good slide that shows what was done when BHP and Rio Tinto were having to go each other.
Right.
And then basically BHP declared the whole of the Pilbara to be a resource.
Of course.
Or exploration target. Yeah. But the point is that whoever made that decision, and I know who it was in South Africa.
Yeah.
And I keep going on at them. That was a stupid thing to do. You've insisted on it on ranges for the most uncertain.
Yeah.
And yet for the one which is supposed to be the most certain, you should be able to give an even more accurate range.
Yeah.
But a range it is. And the other thing is, of course, I think I mentioned in my notes, is that for the geologist to be told that his responsibility in writing a competent person's report is fully diluted, delivered to the front of the mill, is a load of rubbish.
Of course, yeah.
Because the point is that unless you know what the processing does and how much product you can get at the end and whether or not it's saleable, you can't demonstrate economics.
No.
They're conundrums created by ourselves.
Yeah. No, look, we'll find each other on that pretty quickly. But I think that part of the reasons we don't have ranges, and I'm speculating here because I wasn't there when all these famous people sat around the round table and, put their votes in.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you. Who says you can't?
Well, no, it's just, I can't answer that question, but there is currently no ambition in the JOR committee to make those ranges happen. And we've done a survey for 500 people, that had that opportunity to say what changes they wanted.
But who says you can't do it?
Well, nobody asked for it.
There's nothing that says you can't.
No, sure.
So we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah, no, look, again, you make a valid point, but let me make my other point, because I think this is part of the reasons that I see, right? Because I don't know if you're familiar with the Parker Challenge that we put out last year with the Resource Estimation Conference, right? And it was mostly Stavros' idea, I should always state that, but that we all jumped on that, like, that's a fantastic idea, because then we can actually see some of this stuff in action, right? Because it's nice that a Norwegian guy has done some reconciliation work, and we've done the same thing. We know how stuffed reconciliation is at most mines anyway, with the fights between underground and the mill and open pit and everything in between, and all the uncertainties stacked together. Here's a number, there's a number. We'll call that reconciliation on our Excel sheet. Good luck with it, right? And I mean, I'm being very rude here, but so that's difficult, but it's necessary to have that discussion. I'm okay with that. But the problem that we know of is that to a resource classification and to the component of uncertainty, there are two major components. And the great uncertainty that you're talking about is only 5% of that uncertainty. The other 95% is geological uncertainty. And there have been plenty of studies proving exactly that. And with the Parker study, that's the key outcome. We can do all the sampling, varying Taoist studies and bring all the French statisticians to do all their PRG stuff all day long about variance. But the variance will come from the geologist that says, yeah, I think it's kind of doing that thing, right? And that's where your variance is coming from. So how do you capture geological uncertainty?
Gee whiskers, René. I mean, let's face it. How did log normal Bayesian statistics get generated? How?
How were they generated? I don't understand that question.
How did the concept of log normal Bayesian statistics come about?
Well, I guess statistics don't really work if you've got skewed distributions. So you need to come up with tricks to make things work.
Well, it was the maths and the geostatistics that Darnie Cricker put in Krieg.
Yeah.
And the way he did that was he originally took a borehole in the Free State.
Yeah.
And he took the 5 deflections and he worked out the variance within the deflection area of maybe a few meters. Then he took the whole Free State for the basal reef.
Yeah.
And he took each mine, made it into a super borehole, and then he linked the two. And that's how he came up with the size variance relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think, I think there's a sense of cynicism in the comments that you're bringing, which I think
Not at all.
creates, let's say, a little bit of a barrier to being able to use variance and link it to the geology. Look, I'm a geologist first and foremost. I always go to geology. But my next port of call is statistics.
Yeah.
And in oil and gas, as you know, they will have one well, and they will do all of the simulations around that, calculate a distribution, and then they say, I've got the 90%, 50%, 10% confidence in this. Why aren't we doing something similar?
Well, so I think you're not necessarily invalidating my comments here, because I'm a resource geologist. I'm not a Fontainebleau trained geostatistician, but I understand my statistics well enough. And I actually, when I run my courses, I always joke to the people to write on the wall, variance is the resource killer. So I'm on board with the variance story, right? I mean, it's variance through and through, A to Z. And I literally shout this to people, anybody that will hear. And you can unpick, and I'm just saying this to convince you that I'm not just sort of looking past all the work that's been done and what we can do with it. I agree that with the quantitative work that we do that comes out of the numbers, right, that we can do more stuff. It's fascinating what we can do with variance that nobody else is doing, and that's part of it. And I'm absolutely convinced that is a contribution to an uncertainty range that we might come to. But that doesn't invalidate what I said about the outcomes, about particularly the Parker study or any study that you would do, is that when you take 30 mineral resource estimations that have been done independently for the same deposit, the grades will vary by that much, and the geology, the tonnage for that deposit, will vary by 200%. And that's the numbers we're talking about. And we've seen this, and there were 500 people sitting in a room going, holy shit, we kind of knew this, but so how do you, knowing that, let me just finish my point, knowing that resource classification is geological uncertainty and grade uncertainty, or continuity is what they talk about in the codes, how do you uncouple these two to then create the ranges? I think that's the practical problem that people have with creating the ranges.
Well, I don't think that's a difficult problem at all, because it all comes back to the estimation of a grade tonnage curve. Everything has to come back to a grade tonnage curve, volume and grade.
Yeah, but the volume uncertainty comes from the interpretation that is purely up to the geologist and their arm waving and their connected dots game skills to complete.
Well, it shouldn't be. No, but it shouldn't be, because just the estimation of a pay limit and a cutoff means that you should have a commercial model. You should have an NPV model, which is actually allowing you to look at what is your all-in sustaining cost, your all-in cost, base cost, to calculate cutoffs and pay limits. And you can't do that without a financial model. That's another thing. A lot of people, we're talking about expertise. Many geologists just do not have a clue about financial valuation.
But I don't need to disagree with that for the sake of this argument, but maybe put that together with the... Well, could you just, sorry, I do want to go... Can you unpack how you... Because this is usually not a point of contention between any two geologists that are working in the resource space. This is why I said, and this is why I'm enjoying this conversation, because finally somebody who pokes the bear a little bit and looks at some different views, different ways to see these very classic topics. But I can't get away from the observation, and we're not talking about subjective facts here, right? Just to use that popular phrase of the 2020s. We're looking at very objective assessment that if you ask 30 or 100 or 200 geologists to model something, the grade variability, okay, we can talk all day about that statistically, get the whiteboards, fine, right? I think it's a world that we've explored really well, and the geostatistics and the simulation and the multi-point variable statistics, etc., great. But the geology, the volume, the tonnage, so if you talk grade tonnage curve, great, but you still need tonnage. You have the grade, but you need the tonnage. And the range on that tonnage it depends so drastically on the subjectivity of the modeler. This is where all the software companies, you brought software into the picture. This is the very angle, and I had some software companies on this channel to talk about this, and we kind of drift into the same space. How can you create an unbiased machine-learned model from the geology and the drill holes that is actually unbiased and doesn't create this massive range of interpretations on tonnages? That needs to be answered before we can tiptoe into anything else. Do you agree that there is that range in geological interpretations that leads to tonnage ranges or not?
Well, in my previous life as a consultant, if I ever reviewed, let's say, a data mine model, I would actually do it on the basis that we would take exactly the same wireframes that were set up with exactly the same data, and I'd put it in our version of data mine with all the switches hopefully being the same, and run them. And if I didn't get exactly the same answer as the other person running the same computer model, then there's a problem. It better be exactly the same.
No disagreement, but that doesn't answer the question. The question is, if you then ask your colleague and say, here are the drill holes, no wireframes, here's the general geology of the area, what do you think this thing looks like? And the problem is, so I'll give you an extra layer to this. As a consultant, what I see, you can do the statistics on 5 meter space drilling and your problems disappear on volume constraints, right? But the moment you've got 50 meter space data and people that are right on the edge of the 6 o'clock mining clock want an indicated resource for the gold deposit at 50 meters, you can come up with 10 different ways, whether it's Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, or whether it is difficult to create a consistent model, and that creates a huge risk. That's why these deposits go bust, by the way. It's not because the grade was misestimated. Somebody made the wrong domaining decisions, and that's, you can demonstrate that time and time. There is a couple of working groups. Sorry, I'll say a couple more things. Since that came out, and since this whole geology space has been, quote unquote, blamed for the mistakes here. So not the number game, not the statistics space, although there's plenty of stupid stuff happening. It is people drawing connections between dots, to put it really simple, that create things that just do not exist in space. And then everything else you do becomes a non-event because it's already fucked. That's the problem. And you can give the same model and the same wireframe. Yes, that you come up with the same number, but the variance on that has no actual meaning. You know what I mean?
No, I disagree with you. I think the variance has a lot to do with it. And I think slicing and dicing models until you should be able to get a consensus between the geologist and the mining engineer and the metallurgist as to what are the boundaries of your ore body. And if you can't do that, 9 times out of 10, you end up with blobs of ore, which is just as bad.
Case in point.
But at the end of the day, it's an evolving process. I mean, I'm working on a project at the moment where, it's a pegmatite vein type tin tungsten tantalite ore body. And trying to get, I'm a fanatic over quoting widths. Tell me the width of the ore body. Now, it pinches and swells, but I want the average width. Give it to me. Density is another one, which also impacts on your quantities. That's another story all on its own.
Yeah,
but they are all modifying factors, and what I believe is that the modifying factors should be sufficiently clear and concise with ranges, that when you model it using Monte Carlo simulation, etc., you then understand the impact of the uncertainty in those variables, including, as you rightly say, the tonnage. But I think, in my experience, having worked in the industry all my life, it's grade and processing recovery. That makes more of a difference than anything you can say with tonnage.
That's fascinating. I mean, I haven't, and I've had this discussion more than a few dozen times with some pretty serious, seriously qualified people such as yourself. So that's a fairly oblique view, I must say, which I enjoy, but I'm working through where to go with it, because I still feel there's something on the table about the geological, the tonnage range that you get from a geological interpretation. You kind of said it yourself by talking about these blobs. That creates that uncertainty that is a order of magnitude and then some bigger than the grade variability. Not when it is a grade control situation, you got all your data sitting, it's nicely pepper drilled at whatever spacing you want. We can go into that a little bit as well. Then grade is absolutely, becomes more dominant in that equation of where things go off the rails.
You see, I'm a financial modeler. My objective is to get to the financial model where the inputs are systematically able to demonstrate what is the min and the max of the project. I want to know what is the full operating cost, the basic mining cost, so I can calculate a cutoff grade and a pay limit. Mm-hmm. Ore bodies are becoming a lot more complicated these days, so you need to do area cost accounting. Mm-hmm. To understand the impact of the different mining methods. This is Craig Hutton, in his book on mineral economics, talks about the hill of value and how you climb it, how you optimize the value of the project. So he's the mineral economist. We're the guys giving him the inputs. But you have to play ping pong between the two end members because there's no one answer. And we haven't even spoken about the metal prices.
Oh, look, that's another, the whole reason I started OPEX, and people listening know this, is so that I can actually collect data that otherwise you wouldn't have access to, because looking at all the public reports and knowing exactly what people use for their prices, for their resource optimizations, is pretty useful data. And it's not out there anywhere. So I find, and when you then look at how different Canadian companies come up with prices compared to Australian companies, I find that really interesting. So it's pricing.
I'm just being refreshed.
No, you could. Where's my refreshment? Jeez, I need a beer. It's 6 o'clock here, but can I? So I'll let it lie for. But I've got one. Let's do a 10-second case study. This is a project that we just worked on internally, right? It's a narrow vein mine. It's a narrow vein project, and it's got lots of parallel narrow veins. It's fairly old data. There's a lot of drilling. It's fairly broadly spaced, 50 meters. I won't go into the detail of what metals, but it's low grade. It's low concentrations. But high grade, if that makes sense. So, and these veins go on for a while, but there's a lot of structural complexities. They sort of wave into each other. You can talk about your favorite structural setting to come up with the right model for that and how it all happened. I asked one of our resource geologists to build a model for there, and they came up with, let's just say, 800,000 ounces of gold in that deposit. And I felt there was some uncertainty around the model, so I asked somebody else who had not talked to that person in one of our different offices to model the same thing, came up with 2.3 million ounces. Now, the average grades were the same. They were 3% apart, right? And it is because the interpretation that they both had made based on the available drilling data was so wildly different. One person considered there was almost like a tension gas short range continuity from a geological perspective, and that things didn't connect between the drill holes as your eye might be drawn to. So there was a 250% difference, and then you can talk about valuation all you like, but the 800,000 didn't want to come out of the ground for all the financial reasons when you look at metallurgy and cutoff and so on, but a 2.3 would come out of the ground. How would you capture the ranges on that inferred resource, or should it not even be a resource, right? What? And I can give you more information, but how would you see those situations?
I've seen these problems many times. I worked on a project called Okoti in Ethiopia with exactly the same issue. Mm-hmm. And you could either have a small high-grade project or a low high-grade project, a large low-grade project.
Yeah.
There was one or the other. Mm-hmm. But until you actually did more sampling, you couldn't actually solve that problem, which is why it was inferred. But it was either one or the other. The way I looked at it was to get a bulk grade tonnage curve for the big, the big tonnage, and see whether or not the more selected one was a percentage that I could put on the grade tonnage curve for the big one, see whether or not it fitted. Because if the high grade one is 10% of the big grade one, it should fit on the grade tonnage curve.
So how would you approach it? So that's all fair enough, but how would you, we all have our tricks to deal with assessing that, but how would you capture that range then? Because you just said very casually inferred, and I agree with that, but you want a range for inferred. And I don't disagree that would be the right thing to strive for, but how would you quantify that beyond the normal statistics on the grade to capture that variability on the tonnage from the interpretation?
Well, just by doing those two exercises, it's either a large low grade or a small high grade. And then basically the recommendation is let's go do more work.
Okay. Well, that's always the recommendation, drill more holes.
Yeah, let's go do more work.
Yeah.
Well, it's iterative. There are so many paraphrases that people talk about. And at the end of the day, I'm only interested in trying to statistically quantify anything that I do. I statistically quantify the output of my economic model.
Yeah.
Almost to the extreme extent, say, is the MPV output with the level of confidence I have in the feasibility study. That's another matter all on its own.
Yeah.
Does it give me, what range does it give me in terms of MPVs?
But you're familiar with Harry Parker's work and others, right, who have captured the statistics in the classification of resources based on the actual performance of the mine on a quarterly and an annual basis based on confidence limits, right? I mean, that's all familiar territory.
Yes, but you see, look, as I said, I work with audit firms. The audit firm comes in, goes into a big company and says, okay, let's have a look at the reserves, the resources, and the values that you put on the balance sheet. So it's an iterative process. Now, you imagine the problem that we've got in South Africa at the moment with the PGM prices being as low as they are. It's a major problem. They're busy all closing down, all shutting, laying people off, etc. Now, how do you impair it? Because what is that value? How do you calculate it? And that becomes a simulation. But remember, the auditor, when he goes in, he has 4 basic rules. He says you're not allowed to perform a management function. You're not allowed to calculate values. You're not allowed to create a situation of self-review. And you're not allowed to pass opinions on management. Those are the 4 rules of auditing. They have to be independent to assess whether or not what is on the balance sheet is a reliable measure. So they can't tell the company what the impairment should be. They sort of like narrow in the range, and they say, okay, we're going to impair it by this. No, up a bit.
Yeah.
Getting closer,
How do you see the and without going into the rabbit hole? I mean, impairments with all this ESG stuff going on, there are going to be resources that are going to struggle to remain on the balance sheet. I would like to think.
Go and read the ISB Extractive Industries Draft Consultation Paper of 2000.
Yeah.
It's 500 pages, and I've got a copy of it, which I've printed out, and it's fully dogged with statements that really resonate in each topic that we're talking about, including competence.
Yeah, interesting.
And they have thought about it deep and hard. Oil and gas, you don't hear of them taking an oil and gas qualified reserves evaluator and shooting him because he made a mistake.
Yeah.
You don't do it.
Yeah.
And they're an industry, the AAPG, I think, has got 50,000 members. It's much bigger than anything that we've got in mining.
Well, nobody gets shot here, and that's probably this is probably going full circle to where we started, but, the reason nobody gets shot here, because it's very difficult to shoot people. I mean, I call them speeding tickets. I mean, I stole that from Steve Hunt, who's the chair of JORC, and I like that phrasing. but you have the speeding tickets for just all this table 1 stuff and missing this statement and doing some policy related things that are underlining, but it's the competence related stuff of how you do your work. And it's very difficult to draw that line between you've done that right and you've done that objectively wrong. There are some instances where we can say that, but good luck challenging that. And then good luck disbarring somebody because they used the wrong power on the inverse distance formula, right? I mean, that would be a difficult court case, right? So it is.
And besides, I'm not for throwing our professionals under the bus.
No, exactly, because there is always more. And that was my argument with some of these famous cases here that people keep pointing to. There is much more that you don't know that is going on that has nothing to do with that one geologist and how they did that part of the modeling. Perhaps sometimes, but it's the same reasons planes fall out of the sky. It's not that one thing. It's because 6 things all at the right time or at the wrong time did that one thing that made things go wrong. And it's not just the professional often, right? There are definitely cases where you look at a resource particularly where you go, well, that's just a dumb thing to do, and that's just objectively not the right way to estimate a resource. But that gets really subjective at times and difficult to reason through.
René, in the old days, we used to have really first-class investment mining analysts that would unscramble all of this and write analyst reports, which were really top quality, etc. The level of mining analysts that we have at the moment is, certainly in South Africa, there's very few good ones.
Right.
But I mean, those are the places where this should be unscrambled for the market, because if an investor is wanting to decide whether to buy a share or sell a share, he should be able to get insights from other people that have got far better, let's say, competency in understanding the relationship between value and price.
Yeah.
The price is what the market sets. The value is what is this intrinsic number.
Yeah.
Our job should be to be able to coordinate the multifaceted components of the industry technical pieces and get them to work together. Not just highlighting it could be an error in the grade, it could be error in the tonnage, could be error. We need to know where those things are and model them.
Yeah. No, look,
I mean, let's face it.
Good comment. Yeah.
Let's face it. If your tonnage was out by 50%, what would happen? The life of mine would come down.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you don't go mine an inferred resource, but that's why the practicalities around this are so interesting.
So the question is, why not?
Well, because I guess
Remember, an inferred resource isn't necessarily inferred just simply because you don't have a number of samples. It can be inferred because at the moment it's not quite commercial. We have this with tailings dams. The grade is not quite good enough. So we make it inferred.
We need to be a bit accurate here because the codes are quite specific on this particular one. And
Go on.
The most often misunderstood part of, I think, clause 17 in the JOR code. But the whether it's inferred or indicated has nothing to do with the economics, right? I mean, whether it's a resource or not, that's the part of it. It's either a resource and all of those things are either past a certain threshold, and it's then looking at the amount of confidence you have in your interpretation, your data, and so on, but not the level of metallurgical understanding that you have to give that. That doesn't come into play for the inferred. I'll die on that hill, right? So that is, and the codes are very explicit about that, particularly the JOR code, and that's where we are now changing it because people make that specific mistake quite regularly where they say, we don't actually know the metallurgy of this very much, so that's why we'll make it instead of indicated inferred. That's got nothing to do with it. It is
Well, you still have to demonstrate there are reasonable prospects for entry
that is what you
extraction.
need to do, but that's the binary difference between a resource sensu stricto or not a resource, right? And then if it's a resource and it's past all those reasonable prospects, then you look if it's indicated, inferred, or measured.
Well, yes, but if you go to the variance towers and the classification system that I sent you in that paper, then basically the difference between inferred, indicated, and measured would parallel the level of confidence that you have in the economic model as well.
Well, that's good. And maybe I'll put a link up in the description here. But so there is a paper out that you sent me. Anything else you want to highlight here for people to look for this resource here? I mean, on these sampling towers, these variance towers. Sorry.
What I'm busy trying to do at the moment is to take the calculator, because it's in an Excel spreadsheet, and make the calculator globally available. Okay. So it's freely available.
Okay. Yeah.
And I hope that everybody would take the opportunity of taking their sets of data. I'm not. They should always, again, go back to statistics. I mean, the topic that I absolutely go mad over is people quoting their resources exclusive of reserves. Yeah. That is the most ludicrous thing ever. And if you go back to the fundamentals of set theory, which is a fundamental of mathematics, you never destroy the population that you started with until you've depleted it.
So that principle, and I can agree with. I mean, I don't disagree with your exclusive of resources statement, but it's another can of worms, and I think that might be. I think what we're doing here, we're scheduling a follow-up here because there's actually more that I wanted to talk about, but I think it's probably time to maybe leave that here for now. I really found this a very interesting discussion. You've given me some stuff to think about. I'll certainly put some of the links up in the description here. The last thing I wanted to ask you: Did you actually ever meet Warren Buffett, or did that never happen?
No, I haven't Warren Buffett, but I've just read Elon Musk's book.
Okay.
So I mean, if you think that he has just changed the whole concept of rocketry.
Yeah.
And he how did he do it? He read about it, and he's now a rocket expert.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that before I die, people will become more insistent that using variance for the whole process through to the commerciality of the project becomes the mantra.
Well, look, in variance, you find a friend in me any day of the week, so I think we'll leave it there. But thanks so much, Andy. I find it a really interesting discussion, and I look forward to putting this out for sure.
Yeah, thanks.